Okay, hello everyone. Hi, thank you very much for joining the webinar today with us here at CCS Insight. I'm really pleased that you've been able to come and join us. My name is Leo Gebbie. I'm a principal analyst with CCS Insight, and I lead our business in the US as well. Although I am currently back in London and back home for the holidays. So I'm joining you from a fairly dark and gloomy King's Cross today, but really pleased to have you join us. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. And I'm looking forward to speaking today on the topic of spatial computing, which is a topic that I think if you've followed me for any great time, if you've been connected to me on LinkedIn, or if you've seen my output as an analyst before, you'll know is a topic that's very close to my heart, something that I talk about quite a lot. And the thought experiment really for today's webinar is really the question of whether 2025 might be the year that spatial computing takes off. I'm keen to get into that today because it definitely feels at times as though this is a market that is a challenge in some ways, and still a lot of questions that surround its future. So I'm keen to discuss why that is today and maybe give some clues as to where it might be going moving forward as well. Just to say, we are recording the webinar today for replay purposes, but if you are looking to get involved in the webinar later on through Q&A, that is carried out through the chat function, or the Q&A function, I think specifically on the platform we're using. Please do feel free to add questions as we go through the webinar today. My colleague Kane McKenna is joining us, and he will be moderating the Q&A at the end of the call. So please feel free to put your Q&A in through the function. He'll log them, and then come the end of the session, we can go through the ones that have been sent in, and hopefully have a good discussion as well as we get to that point. So I will just kick off by giving everyone just a quick bit of background as to CCS Insight and who we are, in case you have not come across us before. We are a research and advisory company based out of London, out of our offices here in King's Cross, but with points of presence around the world. As I said, I lead our business in the US, but we have research teams based across Europe and across Asia. And we have a broad suite of research. The research that I am responsible for and we'll be presenting about today, of course, is in connected devices, talking about virtual and augmented reality. But as a business, we have sort of four main pillars of our research, with the other ones being telecom services, network innovation, and enterprise transformation as well. We have a fantastic team of analysts who lead our output across all of these different areas. There are many ways you can interact with them, even if you're not a subscribed client at the moment. We have, for example, other free webinars like this one that you can attend. And of course, you can sign up to our blog, which is free to register for and gives you direct insight pieces into your inbox multiple times a week. So if you're interested in any of these topics, we have analysts who are well positioned and ready to discuss them with you. And yeah, it's well worth following us and our output across our blog and other areas to follow what we're doing. And of course, if you are a paid client, if you are on the webinar today but are a paid client, thank you very much for joining us. Oh, accidentally I advanced that. Just to say that the best place to access our research is through CCS Insight Connect, which is our research portal, where we publish all of our research to clients. So if you are looking for our latest research outputs, please do make sure you head there, and you'll be able to access everything through that portal. So for the purposes of today's webinar then, as I said at the start of the call, the thought experiment today really is 2025 going to be the big year for spatial computing? And it really is still the big question for this segment. When will it take off? When will it really kind of get moving? And what will it take for that to happen? And I think part of the reason for this approach kind of came from a view of if anything, I think skepticism that for me as an analyst, I've heard many times that, next year is the year when we're talking about this market. And with 2024 coming to a close, it does seem like a really good time to evaluate that statement once again. Is next year the year? And I think it is particularly significant, given there are a lot of reasons why 2025 does actually look like it could be a really big year for spatial computing. And that's something that I'm keen to sort of narrate throughout this webinar. So I'm going to examine this in a few key steps, really. The first thing that I want to do is look at the current state of the market. Where are we right now? What has happened so far for virtual and augmented reality, and where are we as 2024 draws to an end? I want to look specifically at virtual reality and looking at hardware and software and use cases and how this area has developed and what it tells us about the future. I want to do the same for augmented reality and sketch out some of the differences between these two segments. So again, looking at hardware, looking at software, and then we'll sort of turn to a longer term view towards the end of the webinar. So where is this all going? What does the roadmap look like? And really the question again is 2025 going to be any sort of major turning point for the market? Are there reasons to think that 2025 will be a real significant moment when we look back in the future at where this market really changed direction? And as I said, I'd love to take some Q&A at the end of the webinar. I would love to hear your views. Maybe you'll think I'm right with my sort of views in this webinar. Maybe you'll think that I'm wrong. Let me know. Let me know in the Q&A, and I'd like to have a good discussion and hear about that at the end of the call. So let's start with that bit of that market recap then, the sort of current state of the market. I think what might be a good starting point is to look at 2024 and really just think about virtual reality to begin with and what happened in virtual reality this year. And in a lot of ways, 2024 has been a really big year. I think you could arguably, at the end of 2023, looking at 2024, you could have said, well, is 2024 the year that things are going to take off? Because, I mean, first of all, it's worth highlighting that it was only in February this year that the Apple Vision Pro launched. I mean, this feels like a very, very long time ago now, given how much has happened in the intervening period. But it's less than a year since the Apple Vision Pro launched, and this was the most anticipated headset that we had ever seen coming into the virtual reality market. Regardless of performance, and we'll come back to that in a moment, there was a huge amount of excitement about that and where that was going to take us, and about the fact that we'd have Apple as kind of a headline player coming into this category. And I think there is something to be said that, regardless of performance, where things have gone in that regard, this is a headset that when it was launched, generated a huge amount of response from people who were calling this an amazing piece of technology, a transformational piece of technology that people really hadn't seen anything quite like before. And then towards the end of the year, we also got, for example, new hardware in the shape of the latest Quest 3S headset from Meta. I mean, Meta, of course, has been the company that's really been dominating the VR segment in terms of volume. It's been investing huge amounts of money in its reality labs. And with Quest 3S, this saw Meta really looking to bring a better level of performance to that ultra accessible price point that it's been focused at with Quest for some time now, and bringing the Quest 3S to that $299 price point really was a play by Meta to further broaden out the appeal of this technology for the market. So we've had throughout 2024, some amazing top level headsets, some more affordable headsets, some real good steps forward there in terms of maybe the availability of different sorts of hardware from very significant players. But then, that being said, in 2024, there have undoubtedly been some big challenges as well. If we start off, for example, by talking about the PlayStation VR 2, this is a headset that has been very slow this year. It's had a lot of challenges. And when we look to the original PlayStation VR headset, which did pretty well, it sold pretty well as an accessory to a PlayStation 4 console, that really gave optimism that actually, we might see more gaming companies coming into this space, trying to make a success of it, seeking out opportunity. But Sony appears to have really run into challenges with actually generating interest in the PSVR 2. It's been a slow-moving headset, appears not to have sold particularly well. And now we've seen Sony actually have to kind of open that up and allow people to do more of that headset, for example, connecting it to a PC, really indicative of a device that's not selling particularly well. And then one final thing that I had in my slide is maybe as something that was indicative of the slowness we had seen this year, which arguably I've been slightly disproved about at the very last minute, was the fact that up until a week ago, we were still waiting to hear anything from Samsung and Google and Qualcomm about their combined efforts on extended reality. Obviously, with the announcement last week around Android XR, that has slightly changed things. We now know that we are expecting to see a Samsung headset launching next year, which is very, very positive and promising news for this segment. But ultimately, I think we had some hopes that Samsung might have already been in the market by now, and it has taken a while for these pieces to sort of, it feels, all come together. We've seen some things really take time to move from promise through to fruition. I think that's been why there's been, a bit of a sense in 2024 that there's been a bit of a mixed bag. There've been some really high expectations about where the segment might go this year, but perhaps actually the market maybe didn't quite meet those expectations. If we then look at augmented reality, I think it's something of a similar story, really. There are highs and lows. I think this time maybe it makes sense to start with the lows. One thing that I think we do have to call out straight away is that we've seen two really major companies in the shape of Microsoft and Magic Leap essentially really signify that they're not going to be continuing their efforts in augmented reality. These are two real major standard bearers for augmented reality and have been for some time. But Microsoft this year basically announced end of life on the HoloLens, really giving the indication that there are no further plans for hardware to come from Microsoft itself, at least in the near future. While Magic Leap, it was reported, is shutting down its sales and its marketing teams, essentially seems to be shuttering its efforts on hardware altogether, and it appears to be moving towards a sort of model of acting as a technology licensing company moving forward. So, we've seen two companies that have been very, very much at the forefront of augmented reality and telling the story about the segment for some time, deciding that they're not going to be carrying on with that. Twin to this, I think we've seen enterprise, which has been the segment where augmented reality has really arguably had some success for the last few years, really be quite quiet. I think when we look at the enterprise augmented reality market this year, the companies in this space appear to have been sort of struggling a little bit to keep up momentum. There have been challenges with having consistent pipeline and winning business, and it does seem as though the enterprise augmented reality opportunity is maybe not quite as rich as it once was. And there were some signs of that this might be something that could improve next year, but regardless, I think as we look at these players and we look at the enterprise space, it has been a bit challenging. However, I think there is a couple of things which are maybe a couple of sparks of excitement around augmented reality that mean as we look into next year, we have some reasons for a touch more optimism. One is that, we have again seen Meta, which is a company that's been, very, very much at the forefront of this category, having the confidence to demonstrate a new piece of technology. I was fortunate enough to try the Project Orion smart glasses in Meta's headquarters a few weeks ago. And while there are many, many, many questions about what is required to bring that product to the market, and that's something we can talk about in more detail, the fact that Meta is, regardless, in a position where it has a product that it is willing to demo, to showcase, to start generating some interest in, with a view to bringing to the market at some point in the future, I think is exciting and is something that is a sign that this technology is continuing to improve. And then actually a product that you can basically get now would be something like the X-Real 1 smart glasses, which again I was able to try earlier this year. This is a product that is essentially ready to ship. It's something you can go and buy now. It has a more limited use case and more limited application, but ultimately is something which shows that compact, lightweight glasses with displays in them are increasingly something that can be built and can be developed, and actually tell us something about where this market might be going over the next couple of years. So I think in some ways 2024 has been almost a fairly sort of sensible, useful year for augmented reality. We've maybe seen a little bit less focus on devices that have hung around for a long time and not had success, and instead there's more of a focus on the next generation and what needs to come, what needs to develop to move us forwards. But I think in terms of where this leaves us, we have this sort of quite skewed market at the moment where virtual reality, in terms of shipments, in terms of size, in terms of the number of players, is the bigger space, and we very clearly see that in terms of shipments and in terms of value, that we have a fairly significant number of players now active in this segment, selling headsets, developing content, working with developers to try and grow the set of applications for the market. And there's a sense that really there's some movement and activity happening there, whereas augmented reality, we are looking at smaller volumes here. There are some companies doing some good some good volume in terms of where they're starting from, small companies that are growing in terms of building their units gradually. But in virtual reality, we're looking at millions of units for the category overall, whereas augmented reality, we're looking at tens to hundreds of thousands, and it is that significant volume smaller at the moment. Yet, of course, the thing that is very, very interesting, and I think the thing that remains a kind of a central question at the heart of this market, is we so often hear that augmented reality is the big future growth path that everyone wants to get on, that virtual reality is almost a step towards that journey in the future. And I think that's something that is a very interesting dynamic for this market, and something that I want to unpack as we go through this webinar. So I think I'll do that first of all by talking about virtual reality, as I said, and then we'll talk about augmented reality separately. So let's look at virtual reality. What I want to do is kind of look at the journey this technology has been on, and really just recap as to where we are now and where we're going. So virtual reality has been around for some time, and you could say it's a little bit disingenuous to start this sort of chronology in 2016, because actually the technology has been around for even longer than that. But I think the sort of modern era of virtual reality really kicked off in 2016, where we started to see devices like the Oculus Rift and the HTC Vive coming to the market and trying to really actually create the category of virtual reality moving forwards. And what we witnessed for a number of years was actually quite rapid progression in terms of hardware, where we saw various elements of the technology challenge of virtual reality being solved fairly quickly. So, for example, we saw devices quickly getting higher resolution screens. Also, you'll have to forgive me, the lights have just gone off in the room that I'm in. We saw headsets, for example, seeing boosts in screen resolution and becoming more capable in terms of the display that they were able to offer to users, and more powerful. Crucially, we also saw headsets that became standalone. So rather than needing to be tethered to a PC, the idea that you could just use a headset out of the box with no other devices was a very, very powerful step forward, which took us really through to 2020, when we had the Meta Quest 2. And arguably, I think one of the really breakthrough products for this category, just given that it brought a very affordable VR headset with no need for the devices, a good amount of applications to the market, and really, I think the thing that captured a lot of public imagination at that time. I then think what we've seen since then, though, is kind of almost we've seen an acceptance of the use case, an acceptance of the way that a virtual reality headset mostly should work. The idea that these are standalone devices which work independently of a PC or games console, apart from a few specific examples, seems to have become fairly well trodden now, a fairly well versed and accepted design ethos. So now we're seeing sort of iteration on that design, with things getting more powerful. We're seeing devices getting slimmer and lighter and more wearable. We're seeing more in terms of things like mixed reality starting to become the norm, and being something that's very much an accepted part of the virtual reality package now, that headsets should be able to have, for example, mixed reality pass through. And we're at this point in 2024 where that is an absolute staple, that regardless of whether your device is affordable, whether it's expensive, that we have largely standalone mixed reality, fairly high resolution headsets, and we're slowly sort of iterating on that design now, and we expect it to improve and develop over time. So I think that sort of means that, from a hardware perspective, we'll sort of maybe see continuation down that path, refined hardware. So I think the question probably then turns to, well, what else needs to change to keep driving this market forwards? And really, this is where I would argue that I think the significant thing that we have to talk about, we have to think about, is software. It's about use cases, about applications, and it's about the ways that people might use this technology, because this really does feel like the sort of thing that has held the market back in a lot of ways so far. As hardware is kind of converging on one answer in the virtual reality segment, the question of use cases may be what needs to be addressed. And this is why I'm just going to call on some of the data from our virtual reality user survey that we carry out each year. So we go out and speak to a large number of respondents about virtual reality, and we speak to people who already own headsets, and we speak to technology enthusiasts who are sort of the next generation of adopters for this technology as well. And really, it's a case of wanting to understand what is it about virtual reality that's good, that's bad, that works well, that needs improving. And we look at all this through the survey each year. So when we look specifically at use cases, and we look at what people are using their virtual reality headsets for, the overwhelming thing we find is that people are using their headsets to play games. 91% of people telling us that they use their headsets to play games on. It is not really all that surprising a finding, actually. I think to anyone who's followed this space for some time, it's fairly clear that is the critical use case. But what is significant is that then there is a fairly noticeable drop-off to all of these other use cases, which is where we see, around half of people, for example, using their headset, things like watching videos or exercising, and then a drop-off after that, some of the more emerging use cases for virtual reality. In our survey this year, it is worth saying that for most of those use cases, we did see the number of people using them increase year over year. So it indicated that, usage of these applications is overall increasing. But regardless, we're at a level where there's kind of a key use case, gaming, and then there's everything else. And I think this is a real challenge. It remains something that's quite difficult for the market. There had been a real sense of, for example, Apple coming in with the Apple Vision Pro would move the dial and would get more developers working with spatial computing and drive more use cases and applications through. Arguably, I think, one of the reasons that's not happened is just because there's not a significant installed base there just yet. This is still a very small volume number of headsets, and therefore it's not really encouraging developers to go out and build all of these use cases. But I do think there really is something in for developers. The thing that you want to be looking at are these emerging opportunities, which is, well, where could you build something new? Where are the ways that virtual reality, if it's going to take off in the future, needs something new? And that's where I think we are particularly interested in a few key areas. There are things like video consumption, whether that's both 2D and 3D, attending events, attending things like live sports games or music concerts that are taking place in virtual reality feels like a promising use case, and things like socializing, which has always been kind of core to the vision of the metaverse in particular, as Meta have called this future. They feel like some use cases there that are significantly further down the list in terms of opportunity, but where we do see potentially a huge amount of chance for growth. And I'd just like to talk through a few of those again based on our survey data. For example, if we look at video consumption, there's long been this idea that people might put on a VR headset to sit and watch a film or to watch TV programs, especially in places where they don't want to be disturbed. So the classic example that I think Apple shared when it launched the Vision Pro was that you might sit on a flight, put on your headset, you can tune out of the surroundings and just watch a film on a big virtual display. And I think there is an element of appeal to that. However, this just isn't really anything that we've seen anyone do a particularly fantastic job of so far. When we ask people about who watch videos in their virtual reality headset about why they do this and sort of things they might want to see improved about this experience in the future, there's actually a whole host of things we can see that people want to see improved to make this use case better. People want it to be a higher quality video streaming experience. They want to have access to more of their streaming services. They want to be able to fundamentally put on their headset for longer and not feel as though it's an uncomfortable place to be. It really does indicate that across both hardware and software, there are steps forward that are needed to actually make this better. Now, obviously, again, there's been challenges here with Apple with the Vision Pro. It was criticized for not bringing apps like Netflix to Vision Pro. The flip side to that being, again, that Netflix probably opted not to develop an app due to the limited install base at this point in time. But it does indicate that while there are some of these challenges around chicken and egg and wanting to see user base and wanting to see that user base grow before people develop apps, there's plenty of development that people want to see beyond that in terms of growing and developing this as a way to use their headset. And part of it does come down to headset design. But fundamentally, if the headset isn't comfortable to wear for a long amount of time, then maybe people aren't going to want to settle in and wear it for something like a film. Another use case, and one that I've always been kind of quietly confident about, but I'm yet to be proved right about, is attending live events. I mean, this is something that I've long felt is a big opportunity for virtual reality in particular. Is a use case that I've expected to see grow and develop, and yet it still hasn't quite happened really. We have seen some live events make the jump to virtual reality. So there are examples, for example, on the Quest ecosystem of sports games that you can watch in virtual reality, or music concerts you can watch in virtual reality. And we do see that for people who have tried these experiences, and we asked about this in our survey, that they seem to be really positive about it. People telling us that they attend events in VR because they get a great view, it feels like being there, it's an accessible way to get to an event. These are positive findings, but fundamentally we do tend to find that it's not a highly used use case. It seems to be something that a lot of people aren't particularly aware of right now. But it does feel like something to me that could be really sticky. And the idea with something like sports being broadcast in virtual reality is that if you can offer a differentiated user experience that feels, significantly different sitting and watching TV on your sofa, and importantly, I think crucially, has a social element to it, I think that is something that could be really, really powerful. The idea of sitting in your headset but feeling as though you are sat with your friends at a sports game that you all want to attend is something that could really cut through, I think, and be quite attractive to potential would-be buyers of headsets. But ultimately, it's something that we just haven't seen really being developed just yet. There are efforts taking place. For example, Qualcomm this year at AWE announced a sports alliance with Axido and HBS, which is based around trying to standardize approaches to broadcasting of live events, particularly sports in virtual reality. I think that's something that could bear fruit in the future, and I'll be interested to see about other efforts that come to light as well. I know that's part of the Android XR announcement that we saw last week that I think Major League Baseball was highlighted as a potential partner and to bring content to that ecosystem. So I'm very curious to watch this one, but I see it as one with a potential big opportunity for growth. And exercise is another one that I think we've heard a lot about in terms of the potential for this to be a use case that could be quite powerful as the technology gets people up and moving around. I do think from our survey, this is one thing that I always find very interesting. I think a very neat demonstration of people who already exercise in virtual reality, when they tell us about that experience, we find that it can be quite polarizing, where people do feel as though it's good fun and it feels like playing a game. These really good things that people are happy to get up and moving about because it feels like good fun to exercise in virtual reality. But one of the major challenges, again, comes back to that comfort factor. We can see that people do tend to say that, they don't find exercising in VR comfortable, that ultimately putting on a headset, when you're getting hot and sweaty, feels like something that might not be that comfortable for people to do. Whether or not this one is actually resolvable with kind of the current design of headsets, I don't actually know. Maybe it will be that having something face mounted is always going to be a little bit too uncomfortable, really, in terms of providing a compelling exercise experience. But it does, again, point to something which is right now an emerging use case that people do seem to enjoy. There's something it feels like here to be iterated and developed on, and something that we might expect to see more about in the future. And then I think the final thing to sort of call out at the minute around virtual reality is that there's all of these use cases that are maybe distinct, individual, use one at a time sort of use cases. The idea that you might put on a headset to enter a specific app, watch some video, take it off again. Fine, that could work. But also, I think the interesting thing we're seeing is increasingly an approach now which is based around using a virtual reality headset as a way to engage with multiple 2D apps at the same time, to have this multi-screen display, which we've seen Apple do with the Vision Pro, which we've seen Meta start to build out with Horizon OS, which we've seen Android XR demonstrate last week. The idea that really your virtual reality headset should be something that can power a whole host of other applications in a spatial manner in front of you is something that is actually quite powerful, quite useful. I think we're still seeing that continue to grow and develop at the moment. We're still seeing that trajectory build out as everyone works out how to connect a VR headset with other devices and with other applications. We're seeing that sort of continue to gradually grow and develop and really turn a VR headset into something more like a PC. But I think this is something that, again, very much based around the idea of trying to encourage you to find ways to use your virtual reality headset more. And I think overall, this is the focus we're seeing, is everyone wants you to, when you put on your headset, just be using it for more than just playing games. This seems to be the big focus. I'm also quite conscious, probably quite a bit of what I've talked about so far has been, very consumer-centric, but we should address the enterprise angle. With regards to virtual reality, we've very much seen that there have been a few key use cases that have been significant so far in terms of driving interest in virtual reality. The three things we've seen have largely been, one, learning and training, using a headset to help people learn repeated activities, both hard skills and soft skills that might be able to be trained in virtual reality. We've seen design and visualization, the idea that you might use the VR for 3D design and collaborating with people remotely to work on 3D designs for everything from the automotive industry through to the fashion industry. And then we've also seen this idea that you might use virtual reality for just essentially this social experience, to collaborate with colleagues and to work with them remotely, essentially taking the sort of experience you might have on Microsoft Teams or Zoom, but turning it into a spatial meeting. I think we've seen these three use cases being quite stable as the core use cases for VR at work now for quite some time. We haven't seen a significant amount of disruption over the last few years. I think realistically, we also haven't seen maybe a huge amount of changing in the hierarchy of which of these are the most significant. I definitely would say that learning and training and 3D design teams to be probably the leading use cases, with meetings and collaboration significantly lower down that list. I think with meetings and collaboration, the reason for that being that other workplace tools like Microsoft Teams or Slack or any of those sorts of platforms are still very powerful and do a lot in their own right. And I'm not sure that virtual reality really offers a very meaningful upgrade as compared to that. Whereas the difference with learning and training or with design and visualization is that there are fundamental advantages to doing this in virtual reality. It's very interesting. Obviously, one thing we have seen with the Apple Vision Pro is, I think since its sort of debut announcement, when I think arguably it was pitched as a headset for everyone, but with a fairly consumery slant to it, to 6 to 9 months later, the headset almost being repositioned as an enterprise device. And it seems as though Apple does more consistently speak to the headset as an enterprise device now. Obviously, I think that's very closely linked to the price tag of the Vision Pro, which has led it down that path. But we have seen this playbook many times before. We see a lot of headsets which are very expensive, which come out struggling to meet consumer price points, ending up transitioning to the enterprise. And it'll be very interesting to see what comes down the path in the future from other devices looking at this space. For example, with Samsung's forthcoming headset, we don't have a price point really on that headset just yet. And it would be curious to see exactly where it lands in that regard. So what does this tell us then about, where VR and mixed reality as well is going in the future? I think my view on it right now is that this is technology which feels like it's good. It does certain things well, and it is improving and getting better. But there is a little bit of a sense right now of a ceiling that's stopping the technology sort of moving to that next level, that's stopping it from going from being where it is in terms of, a multi-million unit market to being tens or many tens of millions of units that are being sold year on year. There are some real, I think, significant continued challenges around use cases. And I think unless we see sort of a serious change to try and move that needle, to broaden the tent, to bring more people into this segment and to create new ways to use this device, I think this is going to be something that'll be a continued challenge. As we can see in our user surveys, we do see that lower pricing continues to be something that appeals to people who might consider buying a virtual reality headset to make them more interested. And this is where I think, the approach of something like the Quest 3, which is pictured on this slide, is so interesting. It is, a volume play at a different price point, designed to really try and bring as many people as possible into this segment. But then, of course, we have companies like Apple, potentially Samsung as well. We don't know exactly where Samsung's going to land price-wise. I would expect it to be a bit more premium. These companies paying in the more premium end of the segment may be more focused on trying to build the use cases and drive that first before coming to the price point that's more affordable and more accessible. It's not to say that one of those approaches is right and that one is wrong. Really, I think that the correct approach is probably somewhere in the middle. I think we need to see both an expansion of use cases and a higher quality experience, and headsets broadly overall as a category reaching that more consumer-friendly price point. But I think it'd be very interesting to watch how that develops in 2025. Okay, I'm going to change tack a bit and talk about augmented reality, because this is something that we hear so much about, and we talk so much about in terms of this being a huge technology of the future and a huge sort of driver of future technology and where spatial computing is going overall as a category. And I think with augmented reality, it's important to start off by thinking about desired outcomes really to begin with, because I think so much of augmented reality has been focused on full augmented reality, the idea of overlaying the real world with digital content. So with the sort of imagery I have here, this idea that when you're interacting with the real world, that you'll have digital content overlaid over what you're looking at, you'll have these holographic sort of style projections of things in front of you. And crucially, this sort of approach means that the devices that you're using need to understand the environment around them, and they have to have the ability to project content that's going to be world stable to you as a user, that's going to float really in front of you in the real world. And this is really, really, really hard to do. This is just fundamentally so difficult. This needs loads of processing power, loads of compute power. It needs lots of cameras. It needs advanced display technologies. All of these things need to be built into a headset. And ultimately, this leads to a headset which usually is heavy. It's hard to manage from a thermal standpoint capability. The optics are difficult to balance and manage. There's these constant trade-offs of field of view versus resolution versus brightness. All of these different technologies are so hard to cram in something that's lightweight and comfortable to wear, and ultimately results in devices that kind of go one or two ways. They can be extremely good technologies in terms of the experience they deliver. It's powerful and a good display and so on, but they're massively expensive, or they're maybe a little bit, they're designed to try and bring them down the price curve a bit, but then they trade off in terms of the overall experience, and that becomes a challenge as well. And regardless of exactly where they are on that spectrum, we've seen these devices focused on full augmented reality. We've had things like the HoloLens, the Magic Leap glasses. We've had Snap spectacles in this space as well. And then also most recently things like Meta's Project Orion. All of these products that are focused on kind of full augmented reality. I guess the most significant thing to say about those 4 specific products I've name checked is good luck buying any one of them right now. You can't, basically. The 2 of them have essentially been discontinued. One is only for sort of a demo units, and the Snap spectacles are available to developers on a subscription basis, but you can't go and just buy a pair. So none of these really are sort of real products that are sort of viable and being continued right now. So what does this tell us? Well, really, I think this tells us that right now, this remains incredibly challenging. This full augmented reality vision remains something that it seems to still be a few years away. And this is where I think I'm so interested in augmented reality that's kind of doing basics well. I think the products that have caught my eye this year have been the ones in augmented reality that have been actually just focused on one specific use case, which is a possible thing that can be built and developed, and starting from that point and just building from there, building for that one use case and doing it really well. And kind of 2 specific examples that I think are interesting to talk to. One is on the sort of big screen display kind of things. This is where we have companies like Xreal and Rokid and a handful of other companies who are essentially very focused on giving you that pair of glasses that give you a virtual display that you can watch videos on or play games on. It's basically a big screen display. It's limited in terms of, it's not trying to solve all of the problems of full augmented reality. But if you're someone who wants that big screen display, if you're a mobile gamer or you're someone who watches videos on your way to work, then it's something that is, relatively simple, starts from that point and just kind of works. Similarly to that, a product which I think has been very interesting that I've tried this year has been a pair of augmented reality swimming goggles from a company called Form. They use an incredibly simple display, like a dot matrix display, but to give you guidance while you're swimming in terms of counting your lengths and giving you guidance in real time on how to improve your swimming technique. And it's really interesting. It's a case of taking a form factor, taking a technology that works really well and meshing those things together and to deliver a user experience that's actually, I think, pretty powerful. And that's something that I think has been quite telling to me about the fact that, while some of the technologies we talked about on the previous slide are focused on trying to solve everything, I think the technologies that have done quite well have been the ones that have been focused on trying to solve one specific thing and do a really good job of it. And I think this arguably is something that's been influenced by the enterprise segment, where in enterprise augmented reality, we did see devices which were very, very specifically focused on a use case. So, for example, in things like warehouse fulfillment or in remote assistance, these are headsets that are very much focused on a specific enterprise use case and a need for a specific device in a specific place. Taking advice and making sure it's ruggedized, something like that, so it can be used in the enterprise, and fulfilling the needs of businesses at a specific point in time, meeting them where they needed to be met. I do think the enterprise AR segment is something that has had, I think, it does seem to have had some real challenges. We have seen a bit of the momentum come out of that segment over the last year or two. especially following on from 2020 and 2021, when it really felt like this was a segment that had a real boost actually in the pandemic, and seems to have maybe struggled a little bit since then. But I think the ideas and the learnings that have come from that segment in terms of taking a use case and building from there is something that I think is very, very instructive for augmented reality as we're thinking about the future. So where does this leave us in terms of going forwards? Well, I think, as I said, sort of full augmented reality is something that I personally think is sort of a challenge that remains a few years away. I think more simple, limited type smart glasses is something we can expect to see more of over the next couple of years. And I do think this is quite interesting, where, again, one final finding from our survey that I do want to talk to is this one, which is where we asked people about the features that they expected smart glasses to have. What are the features that people think smart glasses should be able to offer? And we've obviously seen the success of devices like the Meta Ray-Bans over the last year or two, a device very much focused around taking pictures and videos, and starting to build out and add things like AI capabilities to that device and form factor as well. That seems to have resonated with the consumer market, because that is now the feature that people most expect to see in smart glasses, the ability to have cameras to record videos and take pictures. But then we do see that, people expect to see a whole host of features from smart glasses as they roll down the line. And they expect there to be sort of a visual element to these devices. They want them to be able to show notifications. They want them to overlay information about the real world in their field of view. So clearly there is this expectation that when smart glasses begin to broaden out into the consumer market, people do want there to be a visual element to these devices as well. So I think it'll be very interesting to see as this technology evolves over the next couple of years. I think, certainly there's lots of things in the roadmap of where smart glasses want to go in terms of being lighter and more powerful and more compact. But I think really my sort of expectation for this segment is that next year, particularly in the consumer space, I'm expecting to see maybe more stripped back devices that are focused on a specific use case, doing something right before trying to solve the problem of doing everything. I think the doing everything problem for augmented reality still remains very, very challenging, and there's still quite a long way to bring those sorts of devices to price points that are maybe reasonable. So I'm coming towards the end of the presentation, and I think the final thing to do is probably to return back to the initial question posed at the start of the survey, really, which is 2025 the year that spatial computing really takes off? Is next year the year that things people really get moving? I think my short answer is probably not. I think next year is maybe another year like this one, another year of gradual improvement, of companies refining their approaches to the segment, of gradual improvement. It's great to see, of course, companies like Google and Samsung and coming into this category and starting to really expand what they're doing in this space. But I can't help but feel it's maybe going to be a bit of an iterative year ahead, a bit of a year of gradual improvement before things maybe in the years to follow start to accelerate a bit more. I think there is still reasons for optimism. Obviously, we are seeing, more and more big companies coming into the market, and we do expect that does start to help drive that flywheel of hardware and software. We should see, therefore, content and users only improving over time, and I do expect content to continue being something that improves as we go on. We are seeing, I really shouldn't, I think, understate just how impressive some of the affordable VR headsets of today are. The Meta Quest 3S at $300 is a very, very impressive piece of technology, and I think is something that sometimes doesn't get credit for how good it is at the price point it's at. And hopefully we'll only see more devices coming to the market at affordable price points, given as well right now that we have multiple open operating systems for the virtual reality segment. Augmented reality, as I said, I think is going through iterative improvements, and there are signs that we're starting to see that sort of segment gradually refine on its sort of hardware. And then one final thing that I've really not touched on much today at all, but AI is absolutely a tailwind for the development of this segment. I think whether you're someone who's massively optimistic or maybe slightly more cautious about AI, there are so many overlaps between AI and what it can do and what it can offer to head-mounted technologies. I think that's something that's really actually a huge tailwind for this segment, and especially as we saw with Google really putting Android AI right at the very heart of Android XR last week. I think we will see a lot more of that approach next year, more and more companies trying to really knit AI into their spatial computing journeys. But I think in terms of sort of the reasons for caution, and I sort of do, I have to call these out, VR is going to remain the dominant form factor for now, and it is limited. It is inescapable that it is a technology it's suited best to specific locations like the home, the office. It's less mobile. It's harder to see the journey for virtual reality, I think, to go to being a truly mass market technology in the way that people maybe think augmented reality could be. But right now, virtual reality is the sort of half of the market that is obviously dominant. Augmented reality hardware, while it's promising, it needs time to develop. I think I've made that point throughout the survey already. Major brands, while it's great that we're seeing big brands coming into the market, as is clear from Apple coming in this segment, you can't come in and be an absolute runaway success overnight. It takes time. I'm very interested to see what happens with Samsung once its headset launches next year and just how well that is received. But I think it has shown that even for major brands, this is a difficult segment. It takes time to crack. Something, again, I've not actually really spoken about much until now is kind of the social challenges. This is a whole separate thing that I can possibly dive into in Q&A if it comes up, but head-worn devices still have many challenges from that sort of social perspective in terms of when and where you can wear headsets and in what context, and I think that's something that does actually remain a big challenge. And fundamentally, again, the spending, the investment that's required here is still huge. We're still seeing companies like Meta spend tens of billions of dollars on this every year, and other companies investing huge amounts of money. It's tough. It's not easy. We aren't seeing companies easily able to come in and innovate here because the cost of entry is so high, and that probably is a reason why we have to be a little bit cautious in our outlook as well moving forwards. So that takes me to the end of my presentation. Before we get to Q&A, just to particularly highlight, if you found this interesting, if you found this useful, we have recently published a very in-depth report on this entire segment, which basically discusses all of the things I've just talked about in this webinar in depth. It's a PDF that is over 60 pages long with in-depth research analysis, includes market forecast figures, includes data from our consumer survey. It's a really very in-depth piece of work, which we would love to speak to you about. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can get in touch with us through info@ccsinsight.com, and we'd be more than happy to discuss that piece of research with you. We also have the consumer survey, which is something I've addressed multiple times throughout this presentation. That's its own standalone piece of research as well, which again, if that is something that sounds interesting, please do get in touch with us. We'd be very happy to discuss it with you. Beyond that, I think it's important for me to call out that we do try and run these webinars on a regular basis. If you have found this one interesting, then please do look out for future ones from us. We have a webinar coming up in January. I think I should say January 2025. Apologies for the typo there. There'll be one coming down the track about trends in employee workplace technology, which my colleagues Maria Bell and Bola Rotibi will be leading. So please do keep your eye out for that one. It'll be another one that's free to sign up for, free to attend. It should be a really good session. So with that, I'll stop for breath and a sip of water. And Kane, I think if you want to join us, and we'll take some Q&A.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Leo. So yeah, we've had a few questions come in. The first one from Jerome, thanks for your question, is asking if you can address with sort of looking through a B2B or enterprise lens, and especially with regards to form factor, software, and the use cases, what you see emerging through 2025.
And sorry, sorry, tell that again. So specifically for the enterprise.
Yeah, so what you see emerging through 2025 with regards to form factors, software, and use cases.
So I think if I look at virtual reality first, I think the use cases here do feel particularly sort of well set at this point. It does feel as though kind of learning, training, 3D design and visualization, these feel like the things that really stand out. I think obviously in enterprise, with the budget that comes with that, there is that willingness to go for devices which have incredibly high grade resolution. I think that is, I generally would expect devices like Apple Vision Pro, devices like Vario's line of headsets to perform particularly well in that segment, because if you're working on things like high-res 3D design, then obviously that resolution is going to be an incredibly powerful thing for you, and really make a very significant difference. I think in terms of The training element, that's where standalone is a lot more powerful, because it's ideally, I think you want to be able to train people without having to be plugged into PCs. Whereas we do actually see a bit more appetite still for tethered headsets in the enterprise side of things if you're doing design and visualization, because if you're rendering these incredibly rich graphical environments, that just comes with so many associated challenges that often a tethered PC is a tethered VR to PC headset is just going to be the best way of doing things. But I think regardless of where you are, I think the resolution is something that's incredibly important. So we're seeing that be something that's really, really sort of standing out. We hear stories occasionally about deployments of very budget, kind of really old school 3DoF VR headsets in very specific use cases or applications in the enterprise, where you might have people sort of sat in one space and just want to show them a 3D environment. But I really don't see that as something that's got maybe a huge amount of potential moving forwards, and I am a bit skeptical about that. I think on the augmented reality side of things, we are at a very interesting crossroads where it does feel as though, HoloLens magically essentially out of the picture. Other enterprise companies like Vuzix and RealWear and Epson, it feels like they've all had challenges. It feels to me as though the form factors that have been developed there are, still right now the right ones. I think because the use cases are still in, particular environments where devices do need to be ruggedized, they need to be solid for use in, challenging environments. I think that sort of fundamental design needs to remain for the enterprise, because I'm yet to see enterprise AR sort of appealing to like desk-based workers or anything like that. We see these really limited examples of when you might want to use augmented reality for, say, multi-screen displays or something like that for working. But so far we haven't really seen the hardware and the software marry up. We've not seen that particularly sort of come out particularly well for desk-based workers. So I think right now it feels like enterprise AR is very much focused on sort of specific environments, building for those environments with remote assistance and kind of warehouse fulfillment being two, very clear use cases that I probably still see being central to that for the next couple of years.
Just to follow on from that from me, actually. So when we think of some of the most capable AR smart glasses that we've seen through past years, you mentioned HoloLens and Magic Leap earlier, with them sort of like seeming to overcome some of the challenges on creating a product, what were some of the challenges they faced on, I guess, making enough of a success of that where they decided to stay in the market?
It's a good point. I think it certainly feels though there was I think one of the problems has always been that the core promise of what this technology needs to do has always been the same, but there just was not enough progress on those specific devices in terms of building that future. The ideas of what they should do and what was promised was, I think it was a classic sort of overpromise under delivery, and that they never managed to move beyond that point of being a really good sort of technology demo, and to actually being sort of at a scale where they could be meaningfully deployed. Part of that is due to price of hardware, part of that is due to challenges getting developers to come on board and build software. I think these things all sort of conspired in a bit of a vicious circle, really. But I think for these companies, I think for Microsoft, there's just maybe been a bit of a view that the investment required to keep things moving along was too significant and not really in a segment where Microsoft needs to be playing. I think for Magic Leap, it really is just a view of that it's a business that frankly just never made a success and now needs to be sort of moved on to something else.
Interesting. Looking into the future at some of, I guess, the products that are around the corner, we've obviously seen Google's announcement with Android XR and the collaboration with Samsung and Qualcomm there. Speaking specifically about Samsung and the hardware that's coming down the line, sort of where do you think that will be positioned? Where will it sort of its latest foray into spatial computing?
It's a really interesting. I mean, Samsung. I think there'll be a lot of people be pleased to see Samsung come back into this category because, it is coming back in because Samsung has played here before. Samsung does have a history in virtual reality with headsets like the Gear VR, and it had a line of PC VR headsets as well. So it's been in this space before, then moved away, come back. It's obviously a headline name coming into the category again, and will be really I think very, very welcome in that regard. I am curious for Samsung. I think it's in a position where I think it had committed to following Apple into the market before it became obvious that Apple was maybe struggling to make a success of this segment. And I think Samsung has kind of decided didn't want to get left behind, and now is in a position where it's committed to probably offering something that I think I expect from a use case, from an experience, from a user perspective, I think will feel quite similar to the Vision Pro. And therefore, the really big significant challenge now for Samsung and for Google as well is about use cases and about bringing developers on board. I think the biggest problem that Samsung and Google and that partnership can sort of run into is if the headset launches and the use cases aren't there, then people kind of go, well, use case has been a problem for a long time. Why have you not done anything about this? And I think there is sort of a real onus on kind of Android XR overall to kind of build those use cases out, to try and bring developers along so that when that Samsung headset launches, there's lots of ways to use it. I think that will be a real challenge to kind of get that aligned in time for launch, because the early signs are not that there's a massively burgeoning set of developers. I could be wrong, but I think that's where part of the challenge is for me. But I think from a hardware perspective, I'm expecting it to be sort of a very premium device. No doubt, I think there'll be a fantastic sort of display element to it. The AI sort of driven user experience, I think, will be something that will be very powerful, and I think will be quite indicative of maybe where a lot of things will go in the future.
Really interesting, thank you. And I suppose we've now got a lot of household consumer electronics companies names in entering this industry. But with that in mind, you mentioned it, touched on it earlier, there's some of the social challenges around AR and VR. Clearly these consumer electronics companies see this as, potential big business, but I suppose that is something that they don't have a huge amount of control over. It would be interesting to get your view on what those social challenges are, how they can be overcome, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. We've seen a lot of positivity and a lot of excitement around smart glasses, particularly with the Meta Ray-Bans reporting to do really well. But I think there is still something very sort of inescapable about the fact that these are devices that are asking people to wear cameras on their face, which in early adopter phase is maybe okay. I'm currently visiting from California. We're in California. I think it's far more accepted in, tech is more of a thing, and maybe people are more understanding about, the latest gadgets and so on, and people are a bit more willing to adopt these sorts of things. But I think as you roll out to other regions or the countries or the other segments of the population where, questions like privacy and security are likely to be higher, the idea that you'll just be fine to wear cameras on your glasses at any time of the day, I think is going to run into a pretty hard wall at some point. I do expect there will be challenges, there will be pushback, there will be concerns around that. And that's sort of a significant element, I think, with sort of glasses overall. There's then just fundamentally the sort of display element. I mean, with virtual reality, we obviously, I think when Apple Vision Pro launched, there was kind of those couple of weeks when we saw influencers buying headsets, walking around with them on, and to capture their TikTok videos. But realistically, I think most of us do not actually tend to see people out and about using virtual reality headsets. I don't. I very, very rarely see people out and about with them on public transport or anything like that. I think a big part of that comes down to the social faux pas of doing that. Augmented reality, the premise is, well, it'll look like glasses and that'll be fine. But there's challenges with that. One is the glasses, unless they look like normal glasses, I don't think people are going to jump on them, especially if they're not glasses wearers to begin with. And then also there is still the issue of the display element. I mean, if you have a waveguide display that is visible, if someone can see that you're not really listening because they can just see a flickering in an augmented reality display in your glasses, I think socially that could be a huge sort of stepping stone to try and work past it. And I just think there's something very, very fundamental that we're yet to explore, that we're yet to get to, in the idea that you're going to have a piece of technology literally intermediating between your view of the real world and how you interact with it. I think this is something that will be hugely challenging actually to overcome, and I think that will be a break on the category. I think will potentially limit its uptake quite a lot.
Yeah, interesting. I sort of, I guess, draw some parallels to us now always being connected with everyone everywhere on the move, whereas you don't have to go that far back for that to not have been the case. Maybe time for one final question, and another one that you briefly touched on just at the very end of the webinar. AI, how, you mentioned it's a tailwind, how specifically, I suppose, and how can it be integrated into either experiences or the production of non-AI VR experiences, I suppose?
Yeah, sure. No, I think from a sort of operating system perspective, it's very significant what we've seen in terms of progress in terms of building this into Android XR. Very, very significant step forward in that regard, and I think we will see other companies sort of echo this. Ultimately, for any device that's trying to read and understand the real world and tell you about it, AI is going to be a pretty powerful tool. So I think this is just something that, given the positioning of this technology in terms of being head-worn, in terms of trying to understand and read the real world, it certainly feels like a very, very significant technology that will benefit it. I think, we are unfortunately going to have to wrap. I know that there were people with a hard stop. We're going to have to close the webinar down there. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you very much, Kane, for joining us and moderating the questions today. If you have anything else you'd like to get in touch with us about following this webinar, please get in touch, drop us a line. But otherwise, we will see you on our next webinar in January, and have a happy holidays and enjoy the festive break. Thank you very much.